So our first speaker is Sean McDonald. He describes himself as a lawyer who has accidentally ended up leading a nonprofit foundation. He's the CEO of Frontline SMS, and he's also a fellow at the Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab. Our second speaker is Elizabeth Yampierre at Uprose, also a lawyer. She's working at the intersection of law, climate justice, and the environment. She's the executive director of this organization, which is Brooklyn's oldest Puerto Rican community-based organization. It's intergenerational and multicultural and women-led. Sean?
Good afternoon. It's resounding, great. It's an open ecosystem. So my day job is running a technology company that produces open source software. So open research ecosystems are not a natural place for me. I'm going to try and resist making a lot of ecosystem jokes. I think I did it twice. It'll be fast. Anyway, this is an interesting lag to build into a presentation. So I'm not incredibly familiar with the entirety of the type of research ecosystems that you all probably operate in much more commonly. I spend a lot of time working in Africa, and so when I think of ecosystems, this is it, right? Like, this is beautiful, open, safari, savanna. Surely this is how it works for everybody. But that, I think, is actually how most people experience ecosystems. I don't know if you can see that. That's a cheetah chasing a herd of gazelles. The ecosystems are not necessarily friendly places. They are entirely incredibly dense places of adversity in a lot of instances. And so when I think about what are we trying to accomplish with an open research ecosystem, what do I think about what I'm trying to accomplish at Frontline and building open software, the question I keep getting back to is open the means? Is it the principle? Is it the belief structure? Or is it the end? Are we looking for functional use? Are we trying to maximize utility and access? As a means, open ecosystems tend to rely on licensing. So licensing as a way to either exert control or relinquish control of the way that assets are managed, the way that research and ideas are put together and the way that they get used. And that creates what I think of as the underpants gnome problem, which is to say that removing the barriers to something is certainly an important part of making it successful, but it does not inevitably make it successful, right? And that there are a lot of very complicated problems between encountering an open asset and making it impactful in someone's life, or achieving a value through doing that. There are all of these problems, right? These are what I think of as use requirements. These are the problems that I think are, in a lot of the open ecosystems, some of the hardest. They're the ones that are traditionally performed by companies or institutions, right? Like, how do you take a bit of knowledge or an insight or a data set? How do you match it to a problem? How do you then take that, derive a solution from that insight, get the appropriate approval, manage distribution, bring up people's awareness, bring up their capacity to use it, invest and engage them in the value of the outcome. These are not things that are self-generating, right? These are things that require dedicated time, energy, resources, and skills. And as anything, right, I don't know how familiar you are with the term the Matthew effect, but it's actually derived from the Bible, and the actual biblical quote is, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But the idea is that absent some intervening factor, the prevalent market power, the prevalent power structures will continue to exist. They will continue to drive or centralize or do whatever the thing is that current market powers do. And that means that when we're building open ecosystems, if the principle of open is that we believe that things should be open and that the direction of market forces is not toward open, it's toward closed or centralized, then those two things kind of cross purposes, because what we essentially do is give license to the existing power structures to do what they do more effectively. And that's not always a bad thing. I don't mean to suggest that, but it can be, right? There are systems for good and systems for bad. This was alarming to me, though, right? This is taken from Edelman's Trust Barometer. In 2017, the title of Edelman, so Edelman is a market research firm that does an annual survey on trust. And the headline summary for their 2017 Trust Barometer was Trust in Crisis. 90% of people are not sure whether or not the system is working for them, and 57% of them are very sure that it is not. That is more people than voted for any particular candidate. That is more people than agree on most things. 90% of people aren't sure. As an end, though, right? Not as a means, but as an end, open is a completely different thing. An open ecosystem, an ecosystem that pursues open, that proactively engages it and builds the institutions, builds the market forces, builds the sharing systems that enable us to access and maximize value and utility, that's a different proposition. And it is not inherently open in process. GitHub, which is arguably the world's largest single holder of open source code, is not open source itself. As an end, though, if the goal is access, if the goal is process, value maximization, we need institutions. This is taken from a Gallup poll. And this is confidence in America. This is American confidence in institutions. I don't know how well you can see it. Of the 15 institutions named, only 3 got to above 50% in people trusting them somewhat. So the very best of our institutions has a just barely simple majority of public faith. So really, I think we have something of a problem statement, right? We need institutions to achieve the value or the desired end goal of open ecosystems, and we currently don't have the institutions to do that. Or we don't believe that we have the institutions to do that. And it's really interesting to me because institutional forms haven't changed that dramatically in the last couple hundred years. We have, there are nuances, but really we are still trying to solve we're trying to solve new organizational problems with the same organizational tools we have always had, and frankly, that have often created them. So as you've been warned, I'm a lawyer. I apologize in advance, but that means that I occasionally look to law for solutions. And interestingly, I think that law has a very interesting, at least partial solution. And deceptively, they are literally called trusts. So trusts are one of the oldest legal things that has ever existed. They predate almost every formal system. The first time that they kind of appear in common law is during the Crusades. People would leave home and they would place their homes in trust. So someone would look after it while they were away, and then when they came home from the Crusades, there were understandably some disputes, and that's what gave rise to the Chancery courts. Anyway, the point is that here trusts are named the thing that we want them to be, and yet somehow, when you talk about trusts, this is kind of what most people think of. Now, you'll forgive me, my last name's McDonald, so I always default to Scrooge McDuck. And it's true that trusts are used to preserve and protect wealth. They are used to do that in good ways and in bad ways. The United States federal pension system is managed by a trust. A huge number of investment systems and financial management systems are essentially trusts. The Panama Papers were what they were because Mossack Fonseca was an artful international user of trusts. So good and bad. But land trusts are one of the ones that we know and get to see and play with and investigate and experience. And so they're one of the trust forms that I think is a useful place to start when we're thinking about how do we build and protect assets that matter to the public? How do we engage people in ensuring the best possible outcome for something that is so fundamental to us as an asset? And land trusts are huge. There are, I think, more than 700 of them in the United States. And they manage 56 million acres just in the United States. It's an incredible and powerful idea that we can build stewards of commonly held assets, commonly valued assets for common benefit. The United Kingdom takes that a step further. They have what are called civic trusts. And civic trusts are local units. They are small but impactful groups that work in predefined governance structures to understand and maximize the value of land assets in local communities. So they are not just the legal mechanism to preserve the value of the land, they are an active community engagement strategy that works through small, flexible governance to improve the quality and quantity of what's available to the average citizen. And so I suggest that maybe we could be building more civic trusts. Civic trusts are a vehicle by which we can build capacity, we can engage, we can build and model new forms of institutions, new forms of decision-making and governance at the very least, in ways that engage people in the common endeavor of maximizing the value of what's available to us. So this is where that I'm a lawyer and I'm sorry apology comes in. This is more text slide than I want, but I just want to run really quickly through trusts and how they work. Trusts are private law, which means that they are contracts which you can enter into, and as long as they meet kind of a basic level of standard, they are operable anywhere. This is important for internationalization. This is particularly important in data because of jurisdictional issues, and it is incredibly important as we digitize. In ways that I'm sure you see in your own work, digitization has given an intellectual property definition to virtually every aspect of our lives. Whether it's a couple of bars in a Marvin Gaye song, whether it is the intellectual property embedded in a John Deere tractor, all of these things are now starting to become what we previously described as assets. So all of you, both personally and professionally, are creating assets. Or creating things that may disappear, or things that you may want to preserve and invest in and maximize the value of. So the way that a trust works is that you, the grantor, takes this asset and you put it into a trust. Now what a trust does is it gives ownership of that asset to a beneficiary. The beneficiary can be anybody, but the trust aligns that ownership gives a small sliver of that ownership to a trustee, and that trustee is able to make decisions about how the asset is used and managed based on the purpose. Everybody got it? Really? Oh, these next 5 slides are going to be slow then, sorry. So really quickly then, grantor, it's the person who owns the thing. It can be the creator, it can be the platform. What's fascinating to me about this is actually asset definition. I think asset definition is changing dramatically, right? Not only is the ability to make a decision, the opportunity to make a decision over an asset, the way money gets spent or how land gets used, is an asset unto itself, right? But our ability to participate in any system, or the way that we model any system, or the way that we embody any particular fact is intellectual property unto itself. This is, I believe that the digitization of things and the way that it is converting things into intellectual property is a huge opportunity for community governance. It's a huge opportunity to maximize the values that bring us together. What's interesting then is who are the stewards? What do we trust? And one of the interesting things that I pulled out of the framing conversation was that rules are too static. And I think that you might agree, you might disagree, but that governance is a way to make rules dynamic, right? And the operative governance not only has the initial benefit of having a structure that helps make these decisions and a logic, but it is also a capacity, it also helps build your community and your capacity, right? It helps people understand problems in ways they might not have otherwise. And purposes, I don't know if you can tell I'm really enthusiastic about this. Purposes and trusts are one of the only ways that you can create a fiduciary duty. Now, most institutions are bound by profit. If you're not a nonprofit and you're not a government, you generally speaking have a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of your organization. That's not inherently a bad thing, but like most things, taken to its extreme, it has probably cost us a lot. But there is no limit on what fiduciary duties we can create. Land trusts have fiduciary duties to public enjoyment, to conservation, to managing complex ecosystems to the public benefit, right? And I think that those are the things that become really fascinating around purpose, is that putting something in a trust gives us the opportunity to embed our values in it, not only at the moment that it happens, only at the moment of transfer, but in a way that will persevere long after our initial uses, are settled problems. And I think that that's one of the things I see a lot in data licensing, is that people don't want to restrict their purpose. They don't want to limit themselves to how they can use data. So they write hugely general and frankly somewhat abusing data licenses. And it's not necessary if you can also put a purpose behind it with the fiduciary duty, right? And if you look at the way the organ donor program works, like most people have no idea how it works, but we trust it because it seems to work, and we give literally of ourselves to that. The beneficiary. Beneficiaries are also interesting, but way less so. They can be individuals, in which case it's somewhat obvious, but they can also be the public, or they can be groups of people, like people who are afflicted by a condition, or people who suffer a problem, or people who see themselves in a demographic, or people who exhibit a behavior. You can define a beneficiary class as dynamically as you can define a purpose. And by being able to set the moral compass and explain how this thing needs to reach public benefit, you all of a sudden have a legal ability to enforce good governance in places that were otherwise pretty much singularly profit motivated. And that's what civic trusts do. Civic trusts bring it together. They are embedded governance in the management of assets for the public interest. They're already in play in the UK. They're already used in many, many places around the world. And trusts are the oldest vehicle for preserving dynastic wealth, among many other things, available. And this is where we are. This is the value of it to me, is that we are building this incredible base of property, this incredible expression language of the human experience, and we should be thinking beyond our immediate moment. And we should be thinking about how it is that we want things to be used, and we should be embedding those purposes in the things that we create to live that existence and to effectuate the systems and the institutions that we expect to deliver on them. And that will help us prevent things like the senseless destruction of cancer research. The idea is that in an open research ecosystem, what we're trying to do is build a safer future. So here's where we are. We are a group of organizations working with a couple of academic institutions, a couple of governments, a couple of nonprofits, building out model civic trusts for digital and public interest goods. We're building our first cohort now. We have the funding and all of the steam, but we're looking for interesting problems, and we're looking for people invested in developing governance models that serve the public interest with them. So this is not just an opening speech. It is a call to action. Join us. This is a huge opportunity to think about who it is that means to benefit, what is important about that work and what you hope to see it achieve, and how we can build the community-centered public interest vehicles to deliver on those promises. This is the last slide. There's no thank you slide. So thank you.
Okay, so I don't know this is the microphone labeled 12. Okay, perfect. So when I found Sean's work a couple of years ago, I was so excited because it was the intellectual basis for the stuff that we had been blundering towards at SAGE for a long time, because we got started in many ways because of the weaknesses of open licensing around data. And so to find someone with an intellectual background really made me happy. I do have to do a favor for Kathy Hudson, the former deputy director for science policy at the NIH, who wants to know about the underpants gnomes. Okay, Kathy, I did it. Okay. All right. So the reason that we wanted Sean to kick off the assembly was to provoke us to think about organizational structures for change. And in particular to create the idea that there may be actual structural ways for orgs to make things different over time. And so I'm going to now push on you and say, all right, how do these trusts fail?
It's not clear that they do.
Well, so
So-
under what conditions do they fail?
So I think so trusts are a way to assign ownership. If you assign the ownership to a public group, that essentially happens in perpetuity. The management decisions around how an asset gets used are made by the trustee. So when one thinks of a trust failing, one usually thinks of a trustee that no longer does its job or has committed some abuse or fails financially. Right? Lots of times people are the trustee for assets whose time has passed. And so the trustee organization can fail. But those assets are still in a trust and are still held in the public interest. So should someone brush the dust off them and find some value in them many years later, there's nothing to prevent that second organization from picking them back up, so long as they're able to do so in the public interest and under the terms of the original trust.
So this sounds like the actual, like the articles of incorporation really matter.
Yeah, so I'm a huge Constitution nerd. And that's really how I got here, was recognizing that there was nothing to stop writing trusts that instead of being a set of statements or rules, that you could abstract governance into them.
So let's say, we're at Sage where we have a lot of data that people give to us or put into our cloud, right? We act as a sort of a de facto trustee, right? How would we actually go about becoming a clear civic trust? What would we do?
So agilely, I would start small and then continue to build on success. I would take the data assets that you have and I would put them into trust underneath the mission statements and the practical policies that you currently administer with them. And then I would look for who your stakeholder community is by identity type. Who are the people that are donating to you often? And bring them into that governance mechanism. I would take people who use your data and bring them in, bring end users and patients who have no idea that this data even exists, but are concerned about the ways that it could be used against them. So you can just write light touch governance structures, and literally you can just put the asset into a trust. It's one of those things that is deceptively easy to do, like writing a will, and yet still so few people do it because it seems like it should be harder than it is.
Okay. Great. Let's give Sean a hand. Thank you.